Viva, viva Cuba socialista! Viva, viva!
Cuba socialista!
Viva, viva!
Cuba socialista!
Viva, viva!
Cuba socialista! We are outside the offices of London resident and DCD Rights head of IT, Mickael Behn, to protest his part in a $440 million lawsuit targeting cruise ships companies previously involved in tourism to Cuba. After lobbying U.S. politicians, both Democrat and Republican, Behn convinced a U.S. District Court judge in Miami to recognize his claim to his grandfather's shares in the so-called Havana Docks Company. This Delaware-based company held a lease to operate 3 docks in Havana before the revolution. This lease expired in 2004. Rock Around the Blockade, a campaign of the Revolutionary Communist Group, calls on Mickael Behn to drop the claim. We say no to economic war on Cuba.
No.
No. After the Cuban People's Revolution in 1960, overthrowing U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista, Havana's port was among the properties taken under the control of their state to be used in the interests of the Cuban people. Almost immediately, the U.S. government expressed its determination to cripple newly independent Cuba into submission as part of its own imperialist desire for the Americas. It explicitly blocked any attempt for the Cuban state to negotiate compensation settlements with U.S. companies as they had done with former property holders from other countries. The Behn family's supposed financial loss is the fault of U.S. imperialist greed. His company takes aim at the achievements of Cuba's revolutionary people and targets their lives today. The lawsuit set its sights on 4 cruise ship companies, alleging their use of the docks from 2016 to 2019 without paying out to Behn's company has accrued hundreds of millions of dollars in unpaid fees. U.S. Judge Beth Bloom ruled that one of these companies had apparently trafficked and expropriated property, ignoring that the 1934 license explicitly states that the property in question would have defaulted back to Cuban state ownership 20 years ago, 12 years before the first cruise ships docked in Havana. The entirety of this claim has relied on the collaboration of both political wings of the U.S. ruling class in executing the criminal U.S. blockade of Cuba. It is an ideologically motivated economic attack on the socialist Caribbean island off its coast. Behn's case and the 40 other cases being constructed by other U.S. parties arose after Title III of the Helms-Burton Act 1996 was activated by Trump in 2017. The 1996 law, signed by President Clinton and sponsored by 2 Republican politicians, had given U.S. courts unprecedented extraterritorial reach to conduct lawfare against companies doing business with Cuba. This act triggered counter-legislation from the European Union and the UK to protect its capitalist interests from the U.S. domestic courts. Despite such laws, banks and politicians in Britain have shown zero appetite in confronting flagrant economic warfare being pursued by the U.S. The Behn family's personal interest came from their great-grandfather, founder of another notorious imperialist profiteer, International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT. Among the dodgy dealings of this multinational corporation were investments facilitated by bribes to Heinrich Himmler and Focke-Wulf, the plane manufacturer to the Third Reich. Behn's great-grandfather petitioned to the U.S. government to compensate him for the losses in his Nazi venture too, after the outbreak of the imperialist Second World War. Later, Behn's grandfather gifted a gold telephone to gain favor with Cuban dictator Batista. After 1959 and the triumph of the Cuban people in their revolution against the oppressive Batista regime, the Behn family were among the capitalists, crooks, mafiosos, corrupt politicians, and military collaborators who fled the island. Now, the bitter heir to a Nazi-tainted fortune wants to bring back cronyism potential damage by Behn's case is particularly concerning. Tourism was always a significant industry for Cuba. As it recovers, like the rest of the world, from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic and economic crisis, the reopening to tourists from around the world has been jeopardized by Behn's unjust lawsuit. The intervention in the U.S. court system by anti-Cuban agitators like Marco Rubio was no coincidence. The most reactionary forces inside the U.S. are pushing for the state to turn tourism into yet another line of attack against Cuban sovereignty. The socialist island uses the proceeds from tourism. At least 50% of all hotels and resorts are controlled by the Cuban state to support world-healing provision in health, housing, and development, benefiting all Cubans. Behn's lawsuit is the largest of its kind since the institution of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. It adds to threats against Cuba's revolutionary people as they resist the worsening effects of the genocidal U.S. blockade and global crisis. Join Rock Around the Blockade to show Behn economic warfare won't be accepted. Reject British and U.S. imperialist attacks against socialist Cuba. End the blockade.
Hands off Cuba!
End the blockade!
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 Hands off Cuba!
Here today, condemning this imperialist collaborator who lists himself as the head of IT and so forth at DCD Rights, headquarters itself in this office block. Rock Around the Blockade is a campaign from the revolutionary communist group that has, since the 1990s, stood and defended the socialist example set by Cuba and its revolutionary people. We have sent 16 brigades of young people from Britain to learn from and engage with the Cuban people. And whenever you do visit Cuba, as several of us have done recently, you will be astonished by the strength, the resilience, the innovation, the openness of Cuba's revolutionary people. You will be astonished that the revolution is not just something that happened in 1959, but it is a spirit and a project that continues to grip Cuba and represents the hope, the aspiration for the Cuban people, both its older generations, some of whom still remember what it was like in the 1950s, before the revolution, and grips the imaginations and minds, the aspirations of the young people of Cuba, who see socialism, who see the revolutionary project as the best way to realize their goals, their aspirations, their full liberation, personal, collective, and social development. As I said, Rock Around the Blockade is a campaign that stands in solidarity with Cuba. We stand against the implementation of this genocidal US blockade, extraterritorially implemented by countries like Britain, by the European Union. It is through the banks, the law courts, the political institutions of Britain that this blockade is illegally implemented. So we would implore people to look to One Cent for Cuba, a campaign set up across 3 different European countries, including Britain, that looks to take advantage of the fact that Britain, Ireland, European Union countries have laws that explicitly ban them from extraterritorially implementing blockade economic sanctions, and looks to simple, easy steps to expose the complicity, the collaboration between British banking systems, financial institutions, and even politicians, and the US imperialist blockade. As previous speakers have said, Cuba represents a hope and aspiration, not just for its own people, but also for people around the world, through its medical brigades, through its diplomatic, through its political and its military support for the liberation movements, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Wherever Cuba holds out its arms, it always stands on the side of the oppressed and the exploited, and looks to channel their energies to fight back against imperialism and capitalism. That is why Mickael Behn's lawsuit, one of many that aims to take advantage of recent increasing US attacks on Cuba. This lawsuit is so disgraceful because it seeks to cripple Cuba and its revolutionary example, just as it tries to recover and bounce back from crisis and extend itself once again to be the revolutionary, the liberatory example for its people and the rest of the world. Mickael Behn, hands off Cuba! Mickael Behn,
Hands off Cuba!
Mickael Behn,
Hands off Cuba!
Mickael Behn,
Hands off Cuba!
hands off Cuba! End the blockade! Hands off Cuba!
End the blockade!
Hands off Cuba!
End the blockade!
Hands off Cuba!
End the blockade!